Good evening, good evening. Welcome to the second of this term's Marshall Lectures, and congratulations on having the good taste to be here this evening to listen to a very special guest. Before I introduce Safeena, I wanted just to remind you of a couple of things and try to remind you of one of the threads that seemed to emerge from the conversation we had in this room a week ago. Entrepreneurship, we decided, or I decided on your behalf, was getting things done without having all the things you need under your control. Okay? Social entrepreneurship was that plus absolutely intentional mission, absolute intention to right some unjust equilibrium. Okay? And social entrepreneurship was also the ambition to get stuff done at the points at which normal interventions, state interventions or market interventions, weren't succeeding. Okay? And I think one of the things that I hope you'll hear about tonight or think about as a result of tonight is how what Educate Girls has been doing. I think this is the first time I've been able to introduce to you an LSE alum back at the LSE after a number of years, graduating and sitting in this very theatre. It's a huge honour for me to introduce somebody who I first met a number of years ago in Oxford and was completely struck by the things she said to me that day. And what she said was, we live in a world in which a goat is an asset and a girl is a liability. And I was completely astonished by this sentence. I then hung on every word that she went on to say and have been an advocate and a supporter of the organisation Educate Girls ever since. 200,000, roughly, girls in school who wouldn't otherwise be there. It's a really extraordinary story. We're enormously privileged to have Safeena Husain here at the Marshall Institute at the LSE tonight. I'm going to shut up and introduce Safeena, who's going to talk to you. We'll then come back and, as we did last week, ask you to ask her questions. Start thinking about the questions. What am I going to say about the questions? Please frame them as a question. Safeena.
That's on. Perfect. Thank you. Hello, and thank you so much for that warm introduction. And really it's such a big moment for me to be back at the LSE. I graduated in 1995, way before your time. And LSE looked really sort of different then. It looks very shiny and new and very nice now than it did then. But really, it's such a privilege to be here, and thank you so much for coming. Today, I wanted to speak to you very much about my work with Educate Girls that I started, and we will complete 10 years next month, so this is a big year for us. And I work in rural, remote, and tribal areas in India, and so I thought what would be useful is to just go with a lot of pictures and just kind of tell you the story of our work. This little girl, her name is Jyotsna, and she is 9 years old. And Jyotsna doesn't go to school, and I can kind of tell you what Jyotsna does all day. She gets up at 5 a.m., and then she cooks, she cleans, she takes the goats out grazing. She's one of the first people to get up and one of the last people to go to bed. And she looks after her sibling. This is Jyotsna's family. There is no history of literacy or numeracy. Nobody in her entire generational history has ever been to school, and therefore her family doesn't really see the value of an education. It's not working. Let's see if it'll... Okay, now? Yeah. Perfect. one of the things that Jyotsna does is takes the goats out for grazing. And a lot of the girls actually work looking after livestock. And as Stefan said, really, in a lot of places, a girl is truly the liability, and that goat in that picture is the asset and is much more valuable than her. Sorry, this is, yeah. So Jyotsna is not alone. In India, the statistics are fairly stark. We have the highest number of out-of-school girls anywhere on the planet. We have the highest number of child brides anywhere in the world. And any kind of gender indicator. So if you look at child marriage, Rajasthan, where I work, 68% of the girls are child brides. That is, they're married below the legal age of 18, and 15% below the age of 10. So you have these huge, humongous problems, which are also barriers for them to actually get into the education system. That's why I started Educate Girls. I really wanted to build a scalable, replicable, high-impact model to be able to impact girls like Jyotsna. And what do we do? First and foremost, there's no real data. If you look at UNICEF to UNESCO, people will say there are 3 million girls out of school in India, all the way to 6 million. But where are they? Which pockets? It's just secondary data is just very sort of dismal. It's not really actionable. So the first thing we do is we actually go door to door and we find every single girl who's out of school. So it's really like through community participation, we make maps of the village, figure out where the households are, go door to door, look at all the age proofs. That's like the new Aadhaar card now for identification, and really build a database of every single girl from the age of 13 to 14, from 3 to 14. And every house is marked like that. That's our COO, Suresh, who's actually doing the census in this case. So like, for example, this says Educate Girls, household number 70, and there are 2 out-of-school girls in this house. So you can actually drive around all our geographies, and every single house, you'll be able to see exactly what the situation is. Sometimes you may see a star, and what the star means is the families are not really giving you all the information. So somebody has to come back, or you have to really sort of delve a little bit deeper. In the last 2 years, we have knocked on 3.2 million households just to find girls like Jyotsna who are not in school. This was across 9,000 villages. Again, 12 million individuals profiled, and we found close to 380,000 girls like her who are not in school, who are out of school and in household work. This is probably the largest exercise done by one single small grassroots NGO, just going and boots on the ground kind of an approach. So what do we do? Once we find Jyotsna, we actually create a village level champion called Team Balika. Balika just means the girl child. So it's a team for the girl child that we create. So Deepika is our champion in Jyotsna's village. She's 18, she's the 12th pass, so she understands the value of education. And she went door to door in her village, and that's how she found Jyotsna. And she came to convince Jyotsna's parents to say, can you please bring her to school? They said, absolutely not. She went back week after week, month after month, held village meetings, neighborhood meetings, door-to-door counseling. There's a lot of very in-depth community mobilization work that's done to convince parents of girls like Jyotsna to actually bring the girls back in. And after many weeks and months, she actually finally convinced them. And then she actually handholds the entire process of enrollment. So she wants to make sure that nobody kind of gets left out because they don't know how to fill the form or any of those pieces. So she makes sure that Jyotsna is in school and enrolled, but enrollment really is the first step. We know that if Jyotsna is not learning, she's going to drop out very quickly. And therefore, Deepika actually goes into the classroom, regular government school classrooms, and actually teaches Hindi, English, and math to all the 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders, because learning crisis, we know, is also huge in India. So really, we run a bridge course, and they teach, and they make sure that girls like Jyotsna are actually supported through their entire, not just enrollment, but retention and learning. Okay. Some of the other pieces that we do apart from just enrollment and pieces are around infrastructure. When I first started working in Rajasthan, only 40% of the schools actually had a girls' toilet. So really getting the community around, saying what are the issues and what are the needs for the girls. So this is like a school assessment chart. It's highly pictorial that we get. school management committees, PTAs, to come together and actually fill it out. And it's filled out as a traffic light coding, red, orange, and green. So if the school doesn't have a toilet, it's red, and if it's ready and functioning, it's green. So once the community is able to diagnose what is required, then we can make community-based enrollment plans and infrastructure plans and make sure that the school is not just she's in school and learning, but also that the school is a conducive environment and girl-friendly environment with all the pieces that she needs. So to create champions like Deepika, we find them, the recruitment, they're all 18 to 35, but majority are 18 to 25. They're 12th pass volunteers and one per village. We have a 100% saturation model, which means that if we're in a district with 2,000 villages, we will be in all 2,000 villages. So it's not one of those NGO programs that is spread over large geographies, but in scattered. So Udaipur is our largest district with 2,000 villages, and our smallest district is maybe one with 400 villages. So it's a very in-depth approach. We find the champion, we train them. There's about 12 days of training a year. Every 2 weeks, somebody goes and spends a day with them. So there's very high-touch mentorship. And really, that's what creates a champion and then works for educating the girl child. So Deepika is not our only champion. Today, we have over 11,000 community volunteers just like her who are working on the ground. And together, they have brought back over 200,000 out-of-school girls like Jyotsna back into the school system. Doing learning outcomes, we've impacted over 650,000 children's learning outcomes have been impacted. One of the things that we kind of talk about that I wanted to give you a little story is what does it really mean to be a girl in a village like this, right? We talk about patriarchy and the low status of women. But really, what does it really mean? So I was in our Ajmer district a couple of months ago, and we were just doing a round of introductions. And a little girl, she must have been about 12 or so, she stood up and I said, "What's your name?" And she said, "My name is Naraz Nath." Naraz in Hindi means angry. So I said, "Why is your name angry?" She said, "Because when I was born, that's how everybody felt in my family." Another girl, 3 girls down, her name is Antim Bala. Antim Bala means the last girl, because the community hoped that that would be the last girl that would be born. The Team Balika volunteer in that village, her name is Achuki, the one who has already arrived. Because the family was like, "Well, this one's already come. What do you do now?" So the girls actually, more than anything, are growing up knowing that they are unwanted, that everybody would have preferred if it was a son. The lust for the male child is just so strong that every single girl in the village grows up knowing that she's kind of not even second best, is just there. And that's what you have to grapple with, and that's a mindset issue, right? If India woke up tomorrow and believed that our sons and daughters are equal, you wouldn't need and educate girls. It's just like all in our mind how we view girls and the value of women and girls. So anyway, with that whole intention and that mission, we started with 50 schools, and this year we work across over 21,000 schools in some of the most marginalized villages across Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh. So as we grew, and we kind of grew exponentially, we went from 50 to 500, 500 to 2,500 schools, and 5,000, 10,000. It was just like mind-boggling. And it was great, but I always worried about something. And what I worried about was like, you can scale, but are you still having the same value out on the ground? Is it just that you're repeating the same activities, but is there impact? And so how do you maintain that complete fidelity to impact, even at very, very large scales? And today we work with almost 2 million children. So that's a really important question for us. And the second is, as you're going to grow exponentially, where are you going to try and find new sources of funding to be able to close that funding gap? So with that, we actually launched the world's first development impact bond in education. It's a pay-for-performance transaction that ties money to pure impact. So I'll just walk you through really quickly what the transaction sort of looks like. It's a 3-year transaction, and we are now executing the last year of it. It's across 166 schools, covers 15,000 children, and it's in Bhilwara district in Rajasthan. And the two metrics that we get paid on, one is the enrollment of an out-of-school girl like Jyotsna. So once we make our list, a third-party evaluator comes and checks it for inclusion, exclusion, errors and stuff, and then every enrollment we make off that validated list, there's a payment trigger. And then the second is on learning outcomes, are the children learning? And that is on Hindi, English, and math. The third-party evaluator is actually doing a pre and a post-test each year of our 166 schools, and then a comparative, a control of 166. They're checking 70% of the children, which means it's at 99% accuracy, the results that we get. And we're getting paid only on the net impact. So if my children move up 2 units, and the regular government school 1 unit, I get paid only for the balance 1 unit, which is my value add. So that's how rigorous this whole transaction is. It's a first time, it's a proof of concept that has been done. It was the first time it's being done in the developing world, and also the first time it's being done in education. The budget for the service delivery is about $270,000 over 3 years. So in terms of the size, the financial size, it's a very tiny transaction. But in terms of the beneficiary count, it's probably one of the largest in terms of the social impact bonds or other transactions in the world. Educate Girls is the service provider. And so we deliver all the services on the ground. SIF, which is Children's Investment Fund Foundation, a UK-based foundation, they actually purchase the outcomes that we deliver after being verified by ID Insight, which is the outcome evaluator, the third party. But since I don't have any working capital, I can't wait 3 years to get paid. We have UBS Optimus Foundation that is actually providing the working capital to me up front. So in some ways, I have the reputation risk of whether I am delivering the impact on the ground or not. I am actually naked in terms of impact, and what is really, Educate Girls' results. But the financial risk is with UBS Optimus. I'm not taking a financial risk. I get the money as a grant up front. And so we wanted to do this really to be able to test a model where can you tie payment directly to pure impact, and how does that change your delivery, how does that change your organization, and then what kind of results can you really deliver for that. So lessons learned. This was the first time it was being done, so I have to say it took us we were just really trying to get our heads around it, saying what does it mean to deliver to results. And some of the things that we've learned is that it really leads to a much more flexible and dynamic execution. And what do we mean by that? So usually, if you give a charity or you give a grant, you say, we will, pick an activity. We will do 4 community meetings to push enrollment. And then you make your activity-based budget, and you say 10 villages, 4 meetings a village, you make a budget, and then you get funded, and then you deliver the 4 meetings across. But when you're delivering to results, we actually realize that business as usual is just not going to work, because out-of-school girls are not evenly distributed across the villages. We have some villages that may have 50 or 60 girls out of school, and some may have 1 or 2 or 3. So really, we needed much more flexible resource allocation. Do I need to hire 10 people here, and can I just do it with 1 person here? And thankfully, the bond money is flexible enough to give you that kind of flexibility in terms of stuff. The second is, so you have a much more tailored approach. Some way it may be very heavy duty, and some way it may be a much lighter in terms of execution. Very kind of rapid response and course correction. So when you're delivering to results, we realized, for example, that when we were teaching math, and we finished teaching the curriculum, and our children, a large number of our children, just still couldn't do subtraction with carryover. And so, in a regular program, you would just say, my content is done, my curriculum is done, and sort of move on. But here, because it's about payment to results, we actually went in and diagnosed why are they not able to do subtraction with carryover, and realized that for a lot of children, the concept of place value was just too confusing. So we actually had to go back and build, extra lesson plans to make sure that that particular skill was drilled in, and then you saw a huge bump in the movement in terms of learning outcomes in math. In English, we realized that we had the worst outcomes in English in the first year. And we realized that because our team balikas don't speak English, the government school teachers don't speak English, Jyotsna's family or nobody around her speaks English. And so we actually had to make the content much more bite-sized, much simpler, activity-based, that the kids would actually be able to absorb it. We also realized children had many perception issues. The small letter Q and the small letter P, the mirror images, they always get confused. And so therefore, they were not able to progress. So those minute details, we have to go back in there and do this rapid diagnosis and constant course correction. So it's a much more dynamic way of delivering impact. We also realized that some schools are just not moving and some schools are racing ahead. So it's not a content issue because it's the same content everywhere. And we realized things like if the classroom size is larger, you actually need 2 or 3 people in that classroom for learning outcomes to move. And these are all kind of common sense things, but grant financing just doesn't allow you to do that. It's too fixed with this input-out approach, across the pieces. So those are all the things. The other piece we realized, and this was a big learning for us, is the NGO sector. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but you do all this data collection and you ask all kinds of questions and you collect all kinds of data. Then it gets aggregated at different levels, and then you put it in a very nice report to a funder, and you send it across to them, and it's these glossy publications, and you say, we found this out and that out. In the bond, that whole piece changed, because my field staff said, hello, where is our data? If you want me to deliver to results and to outcomes, I need my dashboard. So the entire organization changed from aggregating data and feeding it to an external audience or the funders to actually aggregating data, analyzing it, feeding it back to the frontline workers so that they know how to switch and course correct constantly to be more effective. And this has really been and there's a lot of decentralization that comes with that. We don't sit here in Mumbai or in London and prescribe what somebody should do on the ground. They just need all the right information and then they decide what needs to be done on the ground. So I'll give you another example. For example, we always believed that if you have somebody who's looking after a village, you should just leave them to their own area because they'll just have deeper relationships, they will get to know people better, and the community will respond to them better. In the bond, we realized that if, Mittu was one of our field coordinators, she had a village that was really difficult. And there was there were lots and lots of issues in that particular village, and she just could not get any enrollment to shift. And she would go every single day and she would knock on the doors, and it wasn't lack of effort, but she wasn't getting any traction, any success. So Vikram, who's a gentleman who leads the bond, he said, listen, I'm going to shift this. So he actually moved her to a different area, brought in people, and then realized immediately we saw results. So we realized that actually what we were assuming that was a best practice, you have to keep switching things around. Because somebody else may actually be more effective in that particular context or in that particular location or village. So it allows him to make all of those decisions and do a lot more rapid course correction work on the ground versus this really straitjacket approach of one size fits all. And also we realized the money is just so much better. Grant money is generally year on year, so it kind of is not very enabling to do long-term multi-year stuff. But here what we found was because all the 3-year money was coming to us up front, we could actually invest in building the systems we needed. We built a mobile app to get the data faster, to be able to analyze it and feed it back faster to the ground. So a lot of those innovations we were able to do and do data-driven decision-making because the money was flexible, it was upfront, and it wasn't tied to, it was just much more dynamic. And then, so because of this, we actually have built out now a huge performance management system. So that is constantly kind of tracking how things are doing on enrollment, how are they doing on learning, where do we need to course correct, where do we need more information. And the best thing about it is that it's actually spilling over into the rest of our organization. So even though the bond is 166 villages, that entire performance management system, the mobile app, everything now serves 12,000 villages and 21,000 schools. So it's been a really, really great learning experience for us to be able to take that small geography and take all of those lessons all the way across. So in some ways, it is altering the DNA of our organization. However, there are sort of challenges to this approach. One is that there was no template. Nobody had ever done it before, so there was no way to know what to do, what things should look like, and that was really difficult for us. I think the first 12 months, we were just sort of shell-shocked at trying to figure out and decipher what this journey really meant. I think data, it took us a long time, and especially with third-party evaluation, we realized that sometimes we wouldn't get paid because data on the ground is just so much hard to substantiate. So one thing is Jyotsna's age proof. The third-party evaluator says, we will only pay you if the age is 7 or above. But you may have differing, her Aadhaar card says 7, her ration card may say 6, parents may say something else. So there's no real concrete ways to verify. So you really have to build an M&E system which has a thick layer of empathy around it. And you and your third-party evaluator really have to be kind of aligned on a lot of those pieces. And again, I think because it was the first time and because there was no template, it was just such a huge resource constraint for us. It's 5% of our budget, but for all of our senior team, it was like close to 20% of our time. And even now, it's like weekly reviews, and it's just everybody's eyeballs are on there to make sure that things are actually happening. Definitely more expensive. You have so many different parties. Building alignment is really tough. Everybody wants different things. And also, I think the biggest piece, for me also became after, like now we're in the third year, is to really look at and say, is this a silver bullet? Is this really what will solve the world's problems? Or is it just another tool? And how we use the tool is going to be more important. Right? So DIBs and SIBs and outcomes-based contracts and stuff, they are tools to be able to accelerate social impact, but to always be sure that we use them responsibly, and we're not creating bespoke outcomes, and we're not becoming investor-led, and then you only kind of do outcomes which can guarantee the investor, a return, etc. So really to be thoughtful about that every tool can be really powerful for change, or it can also create perverse incentives. So that's one of the pieces that as an organization we've really been also sort of reflecting on it, saying what will the future look like with something like this. So the results of the bond, these are 2-year results, so we still have the third year to go. But we have actually exceeded our enrollment target, so we've actually brought back 87+% of the out-of-school girls back into the school system. And the phenomenal thing around this is the majority of the enrollment has been for girls that are above 10 years old. And that's a very difficult group because at that point, they're more at risk of child marriage. They're more at risk for, they need it for child labor, etc. So the fact that the bond gave us just such a target that we've actually innovated and built a lot more strategies for reaching the most difficult constituencies. And learning, we've achieved 51% of the learning gains, and 84% of the learnings are from children who are 2 years into the program. And now in the third year, we expect an exponential gain because they would have been 3 years in the program, which again comes back to like a lot of the grant funding is year on year. And in education, I mean, it's showing us very clearly that you have to be in the game for several years for the results and the gains to really accrue over a period of time. Just funding one-time things is really not going to lead to a lot of impact. And yes, and so in terms of the financial target, so UBS Optimus has already recovered about 75% of their investment. And if we hold the same level of performance, they're on track of receiving about 108% at the end of the 3 years. So they will make a healthy return if we're able to hold on to the same kind of performance that we have had. But all of this, there's the bond and there's all this thinking and the technology, but it comes back to Jyotsna. Because we know when she goes to school, how her life changes, right? Every year I'm able to keep her in school, I will delay her marriage. If she marries later, she will have children later. If she has children later, they will be healthier, smaller families. If she's educated, she'll be 40% more likely to immunize her children, less likely to suffer from domestic violence, less likely to be trafficked. But most importantly, as an educated mother, she will be 500 times more likely to educate her children. So basically, it's the battle of our lifetime. If we do it for her, then she will just make sure that it happens for the other generations, for the next generations. And her children will start at a much higher baseline anyway. So really, Jyotsna is truly the biggest asset we have, and the goat is just a goat.
Thank you. Thank you. I was not only impressed, I was also moved, so thank you very much. I'm going to ask Safeena a question now on your behalf. And while I'm doing that and while Safeena is answering, start to think about your own questions. Because this is being recorded, tell us who you are, tell us in particular which program you're on, if you're a student, and try to formulate your question as a question. I'm going to start on the bond piece of this, and I know you're only 2 years in, and I know it's experimental. But am I right to have heard you say that by comparison with grant funding, this is clearly a superior model for getting done the kinds of things you're trying to get done?
Yeah. I wouldn't want to say it is superior to grant funding. I would like to say it is superior to input-output funding. And to make a distinction to saying this money is very results-based, outcomes-based, and that makes it better. So if you had a grant tomorrow that was a results-based grant or an outcome-based grant, I'm sure that would be as enabling too, I hope.
And let's fast forward to the time when Jyotsna's daughter 500 times more likely to be educated. And you're trying to measure something that isn't attendance at school. It's something much more complicated. Let's call it, in the language that you and I were using earlier on, let's call it agency. How might you go about fitting something very hard to measure with the bond principle?
How might we measure agency?
Yeah. So you're saying it works really well when outcomes are at stake.
Yeah.
Okay, but when the outcomes are really hard, where does it take us?
Absolutely, and I think that is one of the risks of transactions like the bond. They'll be very good for certain sectors. They're not going to be great for everything. So they may be very good for immunization, or they may be very good for really highly quantifiable pieces. But you will still need money for things like human rights and anything which is movement building and same-sex marriage or other social justice agenda may not necessarily come under these kind of tools. It may be much more difficult.
Okay. Who would like to open the questioning here in the nearly front row?
Hi, my name is Najma and I study development studies. And my question is, how has this, the program is quite impressive, but how has it changed the dynamics in the villages where the girls come from?
Yes, very, very good question. So some of the things that we've seen, so for example, the first district where I started working in Pali district, when I started it had a 19% gender gap, which meant almost 20% of the girls were out of school. And this is 1,067 villages, so that's a large number of girls. Today, Pali district has a gender gap of below 5%. So that's like the new normal now. So we're monitoring it to make sure it doesn't ever go back to 20%. But that's the shift that we're seeing on that macroeconomic level. I mean, on a higher level, let's say, is that these hotspots are now shrinking, and that gender gap is reducing. But also, when girls are reading the newspaper to their fathers, and they have a whole other piece, right? Parents look at their daughters differently. And that's like on a more family level and more individual level. Or like Jyotsna, she wants to be a teacher. So you see that whole district level kind of impact, and you're seeing impact in villages that earlier, girls weren't going to school, and now every single girl is going to school. And they're feeling very proud of the fact that they have come to a village that has, every single girl in the school system. And then for the individual girls. I think just even our door-to-door survey has such an impact, because the girls for the first time feel like we're important enough that somebody has come and marked every single house looking for us. Because that logo of that girl with the pigtails is just there on every single household. And that in itself just sends a very strong message saying girls are very important.
Right over in the corner, green scarf.
Thank you. My question is, how does this compare to your other program? So do you have any data comparing the learning outcomes and the enrollment compared to the other programs that are not included in the bond?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So our results, I would say, are a lot sharper in the bond because it's a smaller geography. So it's getting to 80-90%. Like, I think we will hit about 90% of the out-of-school girl enrollment. In our others, I would say we hit at about 75%. Or so. And in terms of learning outcomes, again, I think, it's all actually, everything that we're iterating in the bond is now getting to all of our regular schools as well. So hopefully next year we will see the entire, rest of the area have much higher learning outcomes.
So you already have higher outcome in the bond now?
Yes. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Humphrey. I'm doing population development here. I wanted to understand a bit about the mechanics of the bond and the numbers. If I understood you correctly, CIFF ultimately pay for all of this, and because the UBS company makes a return of, I think you said 12%. CIFF are going to pay something like that more than they would have done if they'd paid it up front, but they pay it 3 years later. So they don't want to pay now, they want to pay 3 years later, so fine. But then the next bit is, the UBS entity is taking the risk, but I would have thought, it's a question, so is CIFF better able to assess that risk than UBS?
Is CIF better able to assess the risk?
The risk being that you don't achieve the results, because UBS are backing you and taking the risk in, your program actually doing what it says it's going to do, or something close to it.
But the value add for CIF, in essence, is that they would have had to spend time, money, doing due diligence and assessing all of that. But now they'll only pay on results. And that also 3 years later, so they could be using their money for doing something else right now. So for them, and CIF is giving away, Greta's right here, and they're giving away almost $250 million a year. So yes, their money could be tied up in other projects. And while UBS actually does much more of the risk assessment role and working with the service provider to actually make sure you have the systems in place to be able to reach the impact.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Nadia. I'm doing the Master in Public Administration, and my question is, could you please tell us more about the process of introducing the concept of the schools of educating girls to the families where I'm assuming maybe there was some sort of resistance. So I'm interested in the process of introducing and making families attracted to this idea.
Yeah. And that's a really, really good question, because what is it that shifts that mindset, right? And honestly, I've been doing this for 10 years, and there is no one answer to it. And it really depends on, sometimes there's an information gap. Sometimes it's just, that because nobody else is sending, so you kind of also mirror that pattern. So then how do you tease out a few people and then use them as examples and get everybody else to follow? So it's just you have to go back sometimes weeks, months, and as you're seeing in the bond, years to be able to reach that 90%, 2.5 years of consistent effort. I'll give you some examples. One household, 5 daughters. A woman was in this house that I visited. And again, no husband, just lived with a very, very old father-in-law. And none of these girls had ever seen the inside of a school. And I kept trying to talk to her, and she said, but how will I live? And I said, okay, what do you eat and what do you do all day? So they basically, all of them just crouched around this little mountainside and whatever they found, and they ate and they survived on that, like very, very poor. So I said, how many times a day do you eat? And she said, we all eat once a day. And so really I talked to her about the midday meal and the fact that the school actually provides you with a hot meal every day. And I was like, that's 5 meals you don't have to worry about if you enroll the child, all your children into school. So for her, that was the trigger to bring her into the school system. A lot of the times parents will be like, I'm okay with it, but he doesn't, the father doesn't, or the father will say, my mother doesn't, and then you have to kind of navigate through that whole power dynamic. So sometimes the father's like, I don't care, please take her, but actually he's just saying that to us. And when you go to the mother, she's like, no, actually he tells me not to send her. So it's really, each of those are individual pieces. However, the one thing we've learned is it has to be local person who is convincing. So you and I going into the households are not going to have the impact. Therefore, having the Team Balika member who's from that village is very important. So local agent, local message. Things like, if you educate the girl child, GDP goes up by such percentages, doesn't work. So like, what do I care? What the GDP is doing. But what does work is whenever our field staff are actually telling a story, saying, my sister, my parents educated her, but then she got married, and then she was in that village, and her husband died, and now she's able to sew and look after the children, and blah, blah. It's authentic stories. So in our training, a lot of the time what we're doing is we're asking, we have mechanisms to help people emerge with their story as to why girls' education is important and come up with their own kind of an example, because that's what eventually will help to change things.
Can I know there are lots of questions stacked up, but I just wanted to ask you a question about right at the very beginning. And this is linking back to last week, you'll see why I'm asking this. Once upon a time, before there was a development impact bond, before there was a structure, and before hundreds of thousands of people were engaged with this, how did you get from a view that there was something unjust in the world to an organization? Who did you have to persuade? How much did you have to work with government? How much was it a function of money? I just wonder if you could just sketch that, because I think it's fascinating, this, how do you go from an insight into an unjust equilibrium to this, which is kind of extraordinary and 10 years on kind of mature.
Yeah. I don't know, you're going to fall into it. I mean, I'm not a very smart person, but for me, it was very much like, I think my whole childhood, I was very acutely aware of the injustice of, growing up in New Delhi and patriarchy, and I had a very difficult childhood. So just kind of overcoming that. And when I went back to India, even when I came into the LSE, I was the first person in my family, my entire father's side of the family, to ever go overseas for an education. And my father was going to help me with the tuition and everything. And his best friend and partner said to him, they said, Yusuf, are you sure? It's just a girl. I was setting up a clinic in the Himalayas, and my father came with me, and we were setting this clinic up and everything. And the villagers gathered around. They asked my dad, saying, how many children do you have? And he said, I have this one daughter. And women started beating their chests and crying and saying, how unfortunate, and why did God, be so horrible to you? And I'm like, I'm standing right here, And then they're like, you're still young, you can go get married again, try more or whatever. And it was just like, but every time I walked away, I was like, I can walk away, and I'm my father who says, this is my son, this is my daughter, this is my everything. And yet the girl who's in that village is never going to have that opportunity. So I think for me, it was very much like what I wanted to see a change in. The intention was like, I just can't see this anymore. It always filled me with like so much anger. So it was about changing that, but really, I mean, how did I? I didn't know anything. I went to the government and I said, if I have to change something in girls' education, where should I go? Because India is such a large country. And they said, well, here, these are the worst districts. So I said, can you make me an introduction to that district? And they did, and then I said, listen, I don't know anything, but I want to make a change. Can you give me your 50 worst villages and let me try my luck? And so they gave me their 50 worst villages. Then I went to a bunch of organizations and said, I don't know anything. Can you teach me how to do community mobilization and how to do... I went to UNICEF and I said, how do you do this learning stuff in the classroom? And really, it was just this brick by brick by brick. But I think what helps is the intention of what you want to do, but also the vision of success. That's how I see it. So for example, even now, even though we're like 1,500 full-time staff, 11,000 volunteers, everybody in the organization knows exactly what we work for. So if you know, for me, it's as simple as this. If I close my eyes, I should be able to see the problem very clearly. And I see the problem very clearly. I see Jyotsna, who's out of school and who's working in the house. And then I should close my eyes and I should be able to see success very clearly. And it's Jyotsna in her school uniform and walking to school. And if you're clear about that, then everybody else can follow you. So whether it's funders, donors, whether it's the government, and you can build that same shared vision and bring everybody along to kind of help you achieve it.
Great answer, thank you.
My name is Antonio. I'm in Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship program. I find it very interesting that your payer is an independent organization, that of course their mission aligns to youth development and education. When your goals are educational levels, educational retention, and quality of education that are socioeconomic goals for a government. Mm-hmm. So I would like to know potentially what role would the government play in this transaction in the future, because currently you're doing it with an external party or a non-local party. So how could the government eventually participate in this, and what policies do you think should be in place for that to succeed?
Yeah. And that is the crux of the whole thing. Actually, the DIB shouldn't really be a DIB. It shouldn't be one foundation paying another foundation and whatever. It's just transfer of philanthropic capital. What really SIF is doing here is playing the role the government should be playing. But because there wasn't any template and because nobody else had ever done it in the world, and the Indian government, we actually thought, and so this entire DIB is open source, so you want to look at the design memo, you want to look at whatever. We made it so that we could actually convince the Indian government or other governments to actually play that outcome pay role. Because if that happens, then you will have exponential scope for being able to change things very rapidly. And you're right, the government never, if the government started contracting on performance, things would be a lot better.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm Maddie from the MPA here. Thank you. I just had a question for you about, you spoke about how under the bond funding mechanism, you rapidly decentralized the decision-making around changing course and making adjustments. Could you talk a bit more about how and why that change occurred in your organization?
How and why the decentralization happened?
Yeah, I suppose I'm interested in what incentives changed under the bond as opposed to the grant mechanism.
So one of the pieces is the grant funding, the way it is structured, doesn't allow you to do any of that, right? It kind of holds you accountable to the inputs versus the result. So if your budget says 4 village meetings a village, you just have to do them, whether they're 60 girls or whether they're, you can't actually move resources around. But in this one, because it was very clear that we were chasing just the result and the impact, and nobody was asking us questions saying, did you do X number of meetings or did you do whatever, it was just much faster for us. And also, I think the incentives changed because we were asking our field staff not to go and distribute pencils or to build a library. We were asking them to shift enrollment, retention, and learning. So immediately they started asking us for information and data. And so it was very kind of like demand-led in some ways, and the fact that the money was enabling us to be able to do it.
Hi, my name is Maria from Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship as well. And my question is, did you consider transitioning your nonprofit to create a business model instead of receiving the impact bond, and why? Yes, no, why?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very, very good question. The thing is, there's no revenue model in girls' education. Because if parents are not ready to send her to a free government school, nobody's ever going to pay you to, they are never going to. So low-cost private school models are out, like a lot of those pieces are out. And to be able to do it at that scale, you can't create a parallel delivery. So it had to be very much. So we looked at things, but there was just no scope for what we wanted to do and how we wanted to do it, than to do it as a non-profit scalable model. But to give you a sense of how efficient we've tried to make it, so our cost per child in our entire geography is about $3.50 per child per year. And for that, we deliver to results, to enrollment, retention, learning. So it's a highly leveraged model. It's very deeply thought about in terms of operational efficiencies and how you deliver so that you can, the philanthropic capital is just the tiny catalytic capital that can help you build that kind of result.
Hi, my name's Killian. I work for a company called Social Finance. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what happens after the Dib finishes. So, as well as the improved outcomes for the girls who have been involved, what is the legacy? Is it kind of more Dibs, or is the legacy the impact it's had on the rest of your organization?
Yeah, I think I would say both. One is the legacy that's having on the rest of the organization, and having the performance management systems and having all these dashboards and much more in service of the frontline worker, which is, I think, a great culture shift, and that in any case is a legacy. In terms of going beyond this Dib, we really would like to take the learnings from this Dib and the results that come out and be able to convince governments to become the final outcome payer. And I think that's kind of like the next frontier.
Hi, I'm Thomas from the MPA, and I wanted to know how long did it take to settle the Dib, and I also would like to know if you faced unexpected negative outcomes or bad externalities, and in this case, how are they computed in the outcome in the Dib's mechanism, like the payment per result mechanism?
Sorry, so there were two parts to the question. One was about how it came about and how long it took. Mm-hmm. That's a very painful story. I don't know if I can repeat it. No, I But essentially, since we're sitting here, we put in a proposal for the Girl Education Challenge at DFID, and it had a component of payment by results. So we worked on that whole proposal. It went through the first stage, then the second stage, and everybody said, fabulous, and we will fund you, and then we were going to sign the contracts, and the money was going to come, and we were going to start delivering, and DFID said, no, India. We are not going to give any money to India. And so this whole 9 months of work just went down the drain. But by this time, we had just become so married to the idea that I was depressed for about a quarter, 3 months. I was just like, what is this? And then finally we said, no, let's get up. And then I went on a roadshow across India, trying to talk to foundations, CSR, high net worth individuals, really trying to convince people, saying, can you just pay me on results? And people are like, are you stupid? Why would I? And I was like, really? Like, once I deliver the results, you get it validated, and then you pay me. And people were like, no. We'll just give you a grant. It was like ridiculous. So we went to Bangalore and we went to Delhi, and then other nonprofits were like, what are you doing? Are you mad? Like, what is wrong with you? People are giving you money to do your program and you want to do this rubbish? So there's a lot of backlash from other community-based organizations, and nobody wanted to do it. And then finally we met UBS Optimus, and they agreed, and they helped us and introduced us to SIF, and then they came on board. But it took 3 years. For that whole piece to happen.
There was a second portion, I think, which was something about building the team. Did you ask about? No, sorry. It was about how did you account for unanticipated negative things, or how do you account for that?
Yeah. So yes, there are lots of externalities, so for example, we had expected there to be larger number of children because of the secondary data, but when we actually went on the ground, there were like all these discrepancies with data. And so really all the parties had to sit together and really renegotiate aspects of the contracts and stuff. And there are really, learnings from that. But it was really about how do you build alignment, and all the parties should be able to come together and resolve for those externalities.
Right there, yeah, exactly there.
I'm studying at Master of Public Administration program. I have 3 simple questions. The one is, yes, you said that when the girl is born in the village, so people think it's annoying. So is it the current situation now? Or yes, if so, it's very sad story. And the second question is, what is the measure of the outcome of your working, and what are the main expenditures? Yes.
What are the main?
The main expenditures.
Biggest costs.
Okay.
So let me see if I've got your questions. Okay. First one: is it still the case that children are discriminated against in the way that you describe?
Mm-hmm.
Second question: I can't quite remember. Third question: what are the biggest costs?
So the second question is what is the measure of outcome?
That's right. Second question is how do you set about measuring the outcomes, which I think is clear from the side.
The question about the status of the girl child, yes, it is. However, India is not. It's a huge country, so it's not so much in the south, or it may not be in Kerala. But your Hindi belt, which is your Rajasthan, MP, UP, Bihar, there's a certain section where it is very critical, where it tends to be very patriarchal, caste dynamics, feudal, and things. So there, yes, it is very critical. If I was just to give you a sense of, so the enrollment gap is now in hotspots, but like learning gap, 50% of the country is a gender gap based on learning outcomes, which means that male literacy and female literacy, there's a gap of over 20-25%. And that's 50% of the blocks in India come under educationally backward blocks, which is a gender definition. So it's a huge problem. And really there's a lot of catching up that we have to do for women's literacy and education in that sense. And the third was the cost. So all of our community volunteers are unpaid. They are volunteers. But the costs would be things like the learning materials and supplies that go into the classroom. There are almost 5,000 individual pieces of content, worksheets, which are going inside the government school system. Training costs, so your 11,000 volunteers have to be trained, and that hand-holding support, the mentoring, so training, travel, salaries, and material. Those would be the major cost centers.
I've lost the microphone now. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was on the MSc Philosophy and Public Policy last year. My question, there have been a few questions about how you built the team. My question is revolving around the champion model and how that came about, and how you came to have 11,000 champions in all these villages. And as you say, it was so important to have local knowledge and local influence. How was it a matter of just incredible recruitment behind a really important cause, or how did you achieve that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because when we first started with this natural leader model. So we thought if you do a lot of mobilization and talking to people, certain natural leaders will emerge in the village and they will take this conversation forward. 2 years of that I was exhausted, because it just takes so much time for like anybody to emerge. And then sometimes they don't emerge, and then sometimes some villages have it and stuff. And I was like, oh my God, this is just not going to work. So then we went to a model where we paid people. People were like, it just didn't feel right, because, so then we kind of looked at, what do you do? And so at that point, we won the World Bank's Development Marketplace Award. It was the first unrestricted pool of capital that I got. Again, goes back to like how money can be like enabling or not so enabling. So this unrestricted pool of money, we said, let's experiment. So we had one geography where we paid 1,500 rupees a month, Another geography we paid 500, and one geography we just paid money to like give them a t-shirt and identity cards and trainings and stuff, just non-financial incentives. And then we measured outcomes. And what we found was that the age range, the profile changed a lot. So if you were paying 1,500, you got older people, 500, you got slightly younger, and for unpaid, you got the 12th pass, the youngest people. But the outcomes of those youngest were almost the same, if not higher, than the other two groups. And the minute you stop paying, the other two groups disappeared. But this group just continued. So we realized that being mission-driven and finding the right volunteers and then investing in their leadership and investing in them was much more important than actually paying, because that was not going to be sustainable in the long term. We did that, and then just last year, now that it's gone to 11,000, we were like, oh my God, we've got something going on. And people say, what motivates them? And we're like, we don't know. So we've just gotten very good at like recruiting and training, and we've got all that codified, and everything is codified. But we didn't really understand what is the, the softer pieces of it. So we talked to Columbia, and they have a professor there at the business school who is a motivational theory expert. And she's just done a lot of work with us to really tease out those pieces. And young women join because they really want to see a change in the gender dynamics. They are educated, they want to see other girls. So they're very mission driven. Young men, and 70% of our volunteers are young men. And their motivation is a little bit that I want to do something for my village. It's not about the girls' education lens, but the fact that they work in their own village. People see them differently. They call sir, they are a teacher, they have a position. And also they're using this as a resume builder. It's an internship, I get trained, I have skills, they get a certificate of completion and all of those pieces. So in some ways they're using this to kind of differentiate themselves in the job market. And finally, they all come together for trainings and things. So you meet other young people, and it's a social thing. They're like, my best friend are the team Balikas from this block. And my good friend is from here. And it's just like, it's this big social piece where young people are coming together and doing good together.
Okay, I just want to pause just for a second now to help my friend in the red t-shirt. Those of you who've got questions stacked up, could you please put your hands up? Those of you who've already made eye contact with me, not new ones. Okay, so people I've nodded to. So you can see where we're going. And what we'll do is kind of an arc, an anti-clockwise arc. But I think it's first Gauri, and then here at the front, and then going round those people you've now identified, okay?
Thank you. And yes, my name is Gauri. I work at the Marshall Institute as a research assistant. And thank you so much for this talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. My question is regarding the learning outcome. So I believe a lot of times it may not be in your hands to control that outcome. So I would like to understand how you ensure that they are learning once they are enrolled in the schools. And so for example, sometimes we know that in India, in villages, we also have a teacher problem, that while the children might be going to school, teachers don't show up, or they might not be interested, they might leave mid-class. So how do you deal with those issues? And then don't the challenges become so intertwined? Yeah. So how do you tackle that?
Okay, should we take all of them, or?
No, we're still going sequentially. And at the end, I will try and mop up, make sure that everyone who has a question gets their question. Mm-hmm. Then you and I will just have to try to remember what's been said. But at the moment, we're still doing one at a time.
So I should answer that.
Please.
Okay. So really, you're right. There are lots of systemic issues in the school system. However, our content is a bridge course, so it's a remedial content, right? So there's a school curriculum and what the school is doing, but there are all these learning pieces. So literacy, numeracy, so Hindi, English, math. Our capacity is coming in and doing that. So in some ways, we can ensure our performance based on it. But you're right, there's so many externalities. So I'll give you a couple of examples. There are about 3 to 5% of the children, they can't because they have vision problems, right? They need glasses. So actually, we just partnered with Vision Spring to saying, we are not in the business of giving glasses, but because it moves our learning outcomes, you can come and we will identify those children and you can provide the free eyeglasses. the other thing, and this is like, again, heartrending, and poverty is so multifaceted. I have seen girls like sitting in the 5th grade, like who is supposed to be in the 5th grade, but she can barely sit because there's so much malnutrition and stunting. And that has a big impact on whether your learning outcomes are going to shift or not. So sometimes it's not your content, it's not your training, all of those pieces, the execution can be perfect, but these are like some of the pieces, how do you mitigate for them, right? And so the more poorer the areas, the more difficult the areas, the more all of those things will come. And the more malnourished a child is or stunted the child is, or more poor, then they have a higher absenteeism because they're ill more, and there's so many other pieces. So you'll always have an X percentage of children that even if you have world-class materials, you may not be able to shift it very much.
Hi, I'm Ashmita. Safeena, thank you so much. The talk was really insightful. I have 2 questions. One is, you talked about how when you're trying to convince parents to, first of all, let their young girls come into school, there's a lot of work that gets done on the ground. Question is, great, you're now in school, you've hit one of your outcome targets and things. How much work do these volunteers still have to do with the families to ensure that these young women still keep, is it regular visits? What does that look like? And the second one is, you talked about Jyotsna wanting to become a teacher. How much do you intend to facilitate pathways out of education for these young women who actually come into education?
Okay. So one of the pieces is, I'll take the second question first, which is that yes, we're actually now hand-holding the girls till the 8th grade. And doing this basic literacy, numeracy in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. But going forward, and our next 5-year plan is really about taking that continuum, So how do we do learning outcomes for 6th, 7th, and 8th, and then enrollment into secondary? So those are the 2 new pieces we will be adding, which is saying let's handhold her now all the way into the 9th grade, because that's a big jump, because it could be out of the village and all the rest of it. In terms of your question as to once she's enrolled and stuff, what is, and because we also track retention, therefore, just having her name on the rolls is not enough. So there's a lot of work that our community volunteers will do to make sure that she's not at risk of dropping out. So they're kind of keeping an eye on the registers. So just to give you an example of the 200,000 girls out of school girls like Jyotsna that we brought in, we track retention and it varies anywhere from 85 to 91%. So that's how successful we are in terms of being able to hold on and keep those girls in school. And again, they're like little issues that they have to look at. I was telling Stefan earlier, 2 girls I just met in Udaipur. One of them was not in school, and I said, why aren't you in school? And she said, because I have to go and get water today. And I said, why? And she said, because today I will have a bath. But she had to go, it was such a production for her to be able to go and get enough water that she could have a bath, and then she could be ready and clean, and then she was going to go to school. The challenges they have are just so humongous, but how do you keep hand-holding and supporting them, through what they need is really what the role of that Team Balika volunteer becomes. One of the little girls said, I'm not going to go because the older boys beat me. Right? And so the Team Balika has to go talk to the teacher and talk to the boy. And there's all of these little issues that we make sure that we are there to support her through.
Hi, I'm Frances. I'm an alum of the MPA program. You touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to hear a bit more about this tension between, you mentioned there's a mindset problem that girls are brought up feeling less than, and that's really geared towards a more long-term goal of changing people's mindsets, but the development impact bonds are really geared towards short-term, quite easy to measure outcomes. And how do you sort of balance those 2 goals, and is there any tension between them?
So in terms of, I don't see that much of a big tension right now, because enrollment, and if you're able to do it for 3 years even, and you're able to bring 90% of the girls back, you should be able to, it's not that short term, perhaps. However, ideally, it would be the way we work. So the bond is only a 3-year transaction, but for example, we've never exited a district, because we're hoping that if we're there for 7 or 8 years, we will actually hit an entire generation. right? So if Jyotsna, I can see her all the way till the 8th grade, I will hit about 80% of that generation. And then if I leave, it's okay, because in a few years she'll be married and her children will come into the system and they will come in at a higher baseline. So because Jyotsna would have been to school, she will send them in. So really it's about looking at that philanthropic capital, saying, can I be there for 6, 7, 8 years? And then you're kind of getting into a generational shift piece. But 3 years, because it was a proof of concept. But a lot of our other outcome funders will give us a 5-year window minimum.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ben on the Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship Masters. I have a question regarding your relationship with UBS Optimus. How would you describe that relationship and maybe the influence that they had on your business model and your daily operational activities?
Yeah, are they in the room? No, I'm kidding. See, it's a really good point. Like, the role of the investor is, it can be really good or it can be really bad, right? If the investor is a good, smart, strategic investor, they can help you put all those pieces in place that will help you reach higher results. And thankfully for us, UBS did that. So they invested in our performance management system. They invested in when we needed all those the data things, to be able to see the data and like course correct really quickly. However, you can have an investor that is only interested in the return and holds you by the throat, right? And it's like, where's my return? Where's my return? Where's my performance? And that actually would be, completely debilitating for a small nonprofit on the ground. So UBS has been really great, but that is always a risk in future transactions. Is how is your investor really going to be enabling or just holding you very tightly?
Okay, we have a question over there. I'm sorry to make you cross the room again. And then as we're taking that question, I was going to mop up. Sorry. I've skipped a step. I beg your pardon. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So Martha Hannon, I'm a development consultant. Thank you so much for the talk. It was absolutely inspiring and many questions, but I'll only ask 2. One is...
We've only got one. We're at that point in the evening where we are only allowed one, so pick your best question.
Okay, so here's the best question. I'm really interested in what you said about looking to the state to step in as the outcome payer ultimately. And I wondered if you thought about how to mainstream the other elements of your work, and if so, how you're planning to achieve that.
What do you mean by mainstream other?
So to look to whether Team Ballot will be incorporated into the statutory system for education delivery, the work that you've done delivering census analysis and so on.
Yeah, it's a really good question. We are more interested in the government becoming outcomes focused and paying on outcomes focused versus picking pieces of our strategy to embed in the government system. So that's where we're putting our focus in. But the other piece we're putting our focus on, and this is the interesting bit, is we have such incredible data. So we have all of this door-to-door survey data that we're actually now using machine learning to understand the determinants of the out-of-school girls and see if we can build a predictive model, right? Which the governments and funders and everybody can use. So instead of going door-to-door like we do for 3 million households, we'll be able to predict where the highest concentrations of out-of-school girls may be in these states. And which is something that the system and the sector can kind of really sort of run with.
Okay. We're at that stage in the evening now where just to make sure that everyone who wishes a voice has a voice, I'm going to try to get you to do really fast question asking, and we're going to run them all together. I'll try to keep a note of them, and then I'll ask Safeena to answer them all in a row, as it were. And I know we have a question there where the microphone is, but start thinking about who's next. One question only, as quickly as you can. I'll try and keep track. Go.
Unrestricted funding versus Dib.
Yes. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Next one.
So thanks again for your talk. I would be really interested in hearing just a quick word on the change process inside your own organization, because doing a master's here at organizational behavior, I was wondering like how the initiative was brought up. Was it by you, or how did you facilitate the change process throughout the time that you've developed it and then carried it out?
Good question.
Yeah.
Anyone else keen to ask a question? Okay, we have two questions. Unrestricted funding versus DIB, by which I guess you mean if you had to choose, which would you choose? And the second, how do you handle the change process within your own organization as well as in the culture that you operate in?
So I don't think it's about unrestricted versus the DIB. I would say, today, let's say you gave me unrestricted just for 1 year, I wouldn't, I would say give me multi-year, give me flexible, and give me an outcome-based money, right? So let's you and I be really clear on what is the success we want to see with that money, and that will probably generate the highest impact versus unrestricted or versus the input-output money. And the change in the organization, I think the biggest change is when you're delivering to impact, you actually have to hire a different kind of people. You're not hiring people who are just going to go distribute pencils, but you're suddenly hiring people who are going to be able to say, who's not going to school, why, diagnose, what can I do? So a much more thinking resource has to be on the ground. Their training will become very different. You're not just saying, here's the pencil, this is how you deliver it, but you're actually saying, these are the scenarios, what will you do in each scenario? And how you will be empowered to making your decisions at your village level or at your cluster level or at your block or your district level. So your training changes, your HR systems changes, your recruitment changes. Like I was saying, your M&E changes in a big way. So the entire organizational culture changes a lot and becomes very much with a tight focus on the result and the success versus just generation of activities.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it's my favorite point in the evening where I get, on everyone's behalf, to thank you for an amazing, insightful, inspiring, provocative, brilliant talk, and to thank you for the work you do as well as the talk you've given. I think I'm allowed to speak for the LSE when I say that we are often, or should it be sometimes, very proud of our alumni, and we are tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Amazing talk.